This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rochelle Chase, and this week's book is Corporatocracy: How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians by Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, which was just released November 5th, 2024. Whether we're talking about the Nazis, the January 6th insurrection, or simply political campaigns like Donald Trump's, we often talk about the people. But what about the corporations and the groups behind them? What about ghost money and ghost candidates? What exactly is dark money, and how does it contribute to anti-democracy? These are just a few of the topics I will be discussing with Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, author of Corporatocracy: How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and to Corrupt Politicians, in this episode of Reading with Rochelle. Now, a little bit about Ciara. She's a professor of law at Stetson University College of Law and a Brennan Center fellow. In addition to an impressive list of articles, she is the author of 2 other books, Corporate Citizen: An Argument for the Separation of Corporation and State, plus a book titled Political Brands. Welcome, Ciara. I'm so happy to have you on Reading with Rochelle today.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start because politics is not my area of expertise, but I really felt that after spending 20 years as a consultant and I was working in IT for Fortune 500 companies, the title of your book, Corporatocracy: How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians, that was something that really intrigued me and captured my interest. And what's interesting is I was going through your book and I was going through the different parts, the way you had it divided, where you're talking about, first of all, corporations and those that are you called behaving badly, which I really liked that. And then why this threat to democracy, why it's so important and where we're kind of poised, and then how to fix it. I thought that each of those were very eye-opening and kept me turning the pages. And the reason why I call this out is because I think this may be the first book that focuses on current politics that I've actually enjoyed and I've actually finished reading.
Well, that's high praise.
Yes, I wanted to thank you for that. And thank you for making it accessible to those people like me who aren't maybe experts in this area. So I want to start, though, when we're talking about not being experts, I want to start with just some of the definitions that I think are crucial for people to get before we just jump right in. If you could just define corporatocracy and if you could define dark money and how they're related, I think that would be a good place to start.
Sure. So corporatocracy only exists on the cover of the book. But what I think my publishers and I meant to implicate is the role of corporations taking over American democracy. And then dark money is money that is spent in an American election where the public cannot tell where the money really came from. And dark money goes dark in the following way. You have a corporation, or in some cases, a billionaire, who doesn't have the courage to spend under their real name. And what they do instead is they legally launder it through an opaque nonprofit. So typically this will be a 501c4, which is a social welfare organization, or a 501c6, which is a trade association. And once that money goes through that opaque nonprofit, the public is just none the wiser. They can tell that the C4, C6 is spending in politics. They can't tell the billionaire or the corporation that's really behind it.
I didn't know initially that corporatocracy was a word that you had created, because that's really what captured my mind as well, this whole aspect of corporations and their involvement. And I think that that's something that is not really covered as much. And so that's why I think this book was really important, because it really showed the role that corporations and the money, the various illegal ways that this money is influencing politics. So I really thought that that was an important topic, an important thing to show. And I think you give a lot of different examples of this. There were some that really, really stood out. Like you had a chapter on Nazi enablers, which I didn't really know that much about. The founder of Adidas, the founders were members of the Nazi Party, or that there were actually U-boats with Nazis that landed on the shores of the US with the intent to blow up bridges. And so my point is, can you talk a little bit about, and then there were also the products, but can you talk a little bit about the companies that provided the products or the financial support to Hitler, how that helped Hitler win the party nomination?
Sure. So I describe this when I'm talking to law students as the worst campaign finance story I've ever heard or told. Essentially, this story starts in early 1933 in Germany. And when the curtain opens, the Nazi Party is broke. And they are so in debt that they think that they will have to disband. So they turn to titans of industry to bail them out. They have a secret meeting. They invite the titans of industry to talk to Hitler. Hitler gives a long anti-democratic speech. He says that free enterprise and democracy are incompatible. He also ominously says that the next election will be the last election. And our titans of industry hear this story and they fork over millions in dark money. And at the time, the average German had no idea that these particular corporations were funding the Nazis. So the big funders that I have focused on are the Krupp Corporation, the Flick concern, and IG Farben. So IG Farben may not be a household name anymore. It was a chemical company. What people might be more familiar with is one of its surviving subsidiaries called Bayer. So at the time, IG Farben made everything from Bayer aspirin to Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the gas chambers. And the reason I was able to write about their story is these particular industrialists were prosecuted for war crimes after World War II at Nuremberg. And because Americans did those prosecutions, all of the trial transcripts and all of the evidence has been translated into English, which is a great boon for someone like me because I don't speak German. But it's because I've seen the evidence in those trials where I can say with absolute certainty that it was their corporations that funded the Nazis, not just rich individuals, because I've seen the bank transfers.
Right. Well, you also mentioned some on the American side that I was surprised. I didn't realize that Henry Ford, and I think you called Henry Ford and Hitler had this kind of love fest going on, this equal admiration of each other, and then GM's role in that as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me focus on Ford. In some ways, I have no idea how Henry Ford still has a good name, that people admire him as an entrepreneur, because he was not shy about his anti-Semitism. In fact, he buys his hometown paper and he has them run like anti-Jewish paper after anti-Jewish paper. Then he has those papers bound into books. Then he has those books translated into lots of different languages. And he doesn't copyright it on purpose so that people can copy it for free. And so some of Ford's writings, these anti-Jewish screeds, those are translated into German, where they land in the hands of Hitler and many others. Hitler has a picture of Henry Ford on his desk in his office. And when he's asked who does he most admire in America, he names Henry Ford. And I think Ford is the only American who's mentioned in Mein Kampf. So Ford gives Hitler money. Hitler gives Ford some Friend of the Reich award. It is just disgusting and cringeworthy. Mm-hmm. And it also had to do with Hitler's war machine, because Ford was happy to help give technology to the Nazis that they could use in their war machine.
And you said, I think GM was involved.
GM was also key in providing technology to the Nazis so that they could go forward with all of their atrocious plans. And Standard Oil was also part of this. Like, part of what made the Nazi war machine so impactful was they figured out how to make synthetic oil and synthetic rubber, which are two things you need if you're going to have tanks rolling around or other vehicles that you're going to use to abuse your neighbors and individuals domestically.
And the last thing I think you mentioned that struck me was Himmler's circle, which I hadn't really heard that much about that. Do you want to just quickly summarize the importance there with that as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that seemed very familiar since I study campaign finance in the United States is often if you have a rich donor, they don't just give to one candidate or even one part of a political party. They spread their money around and they spread their influence around. And I saw that in the Nazi case as well. So there was something called the Hitler Fund. I mean, it had a German name, obviously, and some people would give to the Hitler Fund, and then other people would give to the Himmler Fund. And then there were other Nazis who had different backings. But with the Himmler Fund, that also went to funding the Nazi SS, which is their, jackbooted thugs, essentially. And what was really remarkable, at least when I was doing the research for this book, is realizing that you literally had corporate sponsorship for these repressive forces in Nazi Germany. And without that corporate sponsorship, they may not have even existed. I mean, it's just mind-blowing what the difference between having corporate sponsorship and not having corporate sponsorship can be to the fate of the world. Yeah, I think the mind meld between the German industrialists and the Nazi Party is just this horrifying tale of what happens when greed and power intersect in really pernicious ways. Who knows what would have happened if this fringe political party made the pitch to these businessmen and they said, pound sand. Like, why would we do this? But instead, they are intrigued. They were rich, but they wanted to get richer. And they thought that backing the Nazi Party would be a means to that end. And in the short term, it was. They did get wildly rich, in part because these particular companies were in mining, and then Farben is the chemical company. So they had a lot to gain if Germany, which had been under the Treaty of Versailles, which really limited what German could do in terms of getting back on a war footing, like for good reason. They had caused all of this havoc in World War I, and they were not to be trusted. And so the people who craft the treaty that ends World War I, they tried to take the armaments out of Germany. And by rearming Germany, that makes these three companies, Flick, Farben, and Krupp, incredibly wealthy, especially once they get to use slave labor that is provided to them by the Nazis, because then you don't even have to pay your workforce.
And I think you said that you mentioned when you were covering this that these were extreme examples, but you wrote, but given the fragility of the American democracy post January 6th, corporations are at a crossroads in the United States. So can you talk a little bit about how this ties into what happened in Nazi Germany and this corporate support? How does this tie into today in terms of lessons we should be learning from this?
I want to be clear that I don't think any modern American political party is akin to the Nazis, and I hope it stays that way. But I do think there are lessons to learn from the big business bailout of the Nazis in 1933. The thing that inspired me to write this book at all was the events at the Capitol on January 6th, in part because I had been a Senate staffer right out of college. And one of the things that happened to have happened while I was a Senate staffer is 2 Capitol police officers were killed. They were killed in the line of duty. They were trying to stop a gunman who wanted to be on the Capitol property. And I remember going to their funeral in the rotunda. And so when January 6th happened, I felt like PTSD of that feeling of just dread that the people who guard the Capitol do so that all of us can have a functioning democracy. And by attacking them, especially attacking them with such violence and in such a big crowd, you really imperiled the functioning of our Constitution. Because remember, Congress is there that day, not for the fun of it. It wasn't like a random Tuesday. They were there because the Constitution required it of them. Under the 12th Amendment, Congress has to count the electoral votes from the states, and they have to certify who the new president is going to be. That's what they were doing there, and that's what that mob interrupted. And this is the first time we have had an interruption of the peaceful transfer of power ever in the United States, going back to 1801, where John Adams hands over the reins to Thomas Jefferson. They were not of the same political party, but they did it peacefully. And they did not like each other at the time. They sort of made up later in life. But I don't think people appreciate what an incredible rupture it was to not have a peaceful transfer of power on January 6, 2021. So that is part of why my hair is on fire about the state of American democracy, because if they had been better armed, which in a country with this many arms, I'm sort of surprised that they were not, or if they had more money backing them, then the outcome could have been quite different. And that's what sort of keeps me up at night, that whatever the equivalent of our German industrialists, that they will join forces with the anti-democratic fringe in the United States. And if we have a different January 6th, that the outcome could be very different than the one that we saw.
A lot of times when we focus on January 6th, we're just focusing on, not like that's not important, but we're focusing on the players who were the instigators of the insurrection. What's Trump's involvement? All of this, which is very important. But what your book pointed out, which I didn't really, again, know, was this kind of behind the scenes players. I think you walked through the Rule of Law Defense Fund and then the Republican Attorneys General Association, and there were major corporate donors. Can you just walk through to give listeners an example of what that behind the scenes looked like?
Yes. So I focus on the Rule of Law Defense Fund, which I realize most people have never heard of. It is an offshoot of the Republican Attorneys General Association, better known as RAGA. RAGA is over 50% of its funding comes from either publicly traded corporations and or their trade associations. So one of the things I do in my book is I actually name names. And so I have a list of the top 10 funders of RAGA in 2020, which is the relevant period. So I'll rattle those off really quickly. We have Blue Cross, Altria, Comcast, Walmart, AT&T, CVS, Home Depot, Anheuser-Busch, Fresenius, and Pfizer. And I doubt that those corporations thought when they gave to the Rule of Law Defense Fund, or RAGA, that they would be funding a insurrection. So I think it's also fair to ask the question, okay, well, what did they do after January 6th? And there was this little, honeymoon period after January 6th where corporations came out of the woodworks and they said, we will not fund what some people call critically the Sedition Caucus. So what they mean by the Sedition Caucus is those Republicans who refused to certify the Biden win on January 6th. And so lots of corporations said, we're not going to fund the Sedition Caucus anymore. We learned our lesson. That was horrible. We will be better. But if you fast forward 4 years, most corporations that made that claim, including some of our good friends who were funders of RAGA in 2020, they reneged on that claim. I mean, a few of them didn't even bother to say we'll be better. They just continued to spend. But some of those donors who are now funders of the Sedition Caucus include AT&T, Comcast, Home Depot, Walmart, and Pfizer. And these are brand name blue chip companies, but they haven't, I think, gotten any real blowback for their support of the Sedition Caucus. And I think that is a shame.
Yeah, well, and then you call out specific names. I mean, that's what also I found very interesting about your book is that you were able to trace back and find some of these actual companies that have participated, because then you also did call out, I think Julie Fancelli, the heiress of Publix, the grocery store. fortune that she had contributed millions of dollars to transportation and to getting people, as many people there to the Capitol as possible. I think you also pointed out My Pillow paid for advertising. Is this correct?
Yes. So the public's heiress, I strongly suspect, though it's hard to know because you can't get into someone else's brain.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt that she thought she was funding an insurrection.
Right.
Nonetheless, she put in millions of dollars to bus people from all over the country to the Capitol that day. And then some of the people that she underwrote were part of the insurrection. So I try to be very careful and meticulous that I think certain people like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, they seem to be premeditated with planning violence that day.
Mm-hmm.
She is just bankrolling people going to the Capitol, which could be a really, in other circumstances, an admirable thing. I want Americans to visit their capital, to enjoy the sights of Washington, to talk to their representatives and their senators, and they can get an audience with the president, talk to the president as well. But the idea that you were sending them on for a January 6th event, it does raise this question of what was she thinking? What was she, what did she hope would happen that day?
There's so much more we could talk about with January 6th, because that is kind of like threaded throughout. But I want to talk about, again, some other terms that were new to me as well when you were talking about ghost money and ghost candidates. Can you, again, explain what those are? And there was a specific example that you were using to talk about why that's important.
Sure. So the ghost candidate scandal happened or came to light in 2020 in my home state of Florida. And I think it got a little lost in the wash because there were so many other problems or controversies around the 2020 election that this particular real problem got completely, I think, missed by most national media. Mm-hmm. So the ghost candidate scandal was the following. This was a plot by Republicans in Florida to split the vote and to help elect Republicans. So in 3 different state Senate races in Florida, ghost candidates are run. And what I mean by a ghost candidate is they pop up out of nowhere. They're not affiliated with either party. And the plot was, we're going to send mailers to Democratic voters that will encourage them to vote for the ghost candidate. And the mailers that they happen to send out feature this sort of attractive Black woman. And then there's some ambiguous text where I think it would be reasonable for a voter who receives such a mailer to think that the attractive Black woman actually is the candidate. She was just a stock photo. And so they have these mailers, one of which was for a candidate whose first name is Justine. And Justine is a white woman. So this has been called political blackface, where you send this picture of this attractive Black woman to the Democratic voters. You try to siphon off your vote for Justine. And by doing so, you elect Republicans in all 3 of these Senate races where this was attempted. So from the point of view of the Republicans who masterminded this, it worked. They did split the Democratic vote, and they did elect Republicans in these seats. Now, the reason why this is a money in politics story is this is one of those situations where you have a whistleblower. And when you're talking about dark money, as in the money that a average person cannot tell where the money came from, the only way you can get to the bottom of that is either through litigation. So with litigation, you're going to have some discovery. That's what we had in the Nuremberg case with the Nazis. The evidence in that criminal case shows where the dark money really came from. And in the ghost candidate scandal in Florida, you have a leak. There's someone on the inside who's telling reporters something that the public didn't know. So the leaker has been dumping all of these documents with Florida papers, and the Florida papers have been publishing them. And so what we can see from those leaks is the funding for the ghost candidate scandal came from a company called Florida Power and Light. So Florida Power and Light is a large utility in Florida, and it spends on the record in Florida all the time. And you can even look up what they were spending in 2020. And if you look at what they're spending on the record, it looks tiny. They're giving $1,000 here and $1,000 there. It doesn't look like a really big story. But once you have the leak and the whistleblower documents, you can see millions of dollars going from Florida Power and Light through all these intermediaries until it reaches Florida-based PACs that put out the blackface mailers. And one of the reasons I care about Florida Power and Light is not only is it a large entity in and of itself, it is also a subsidiary of an even bigger corporation called Next Era Energy, which is a publicly traded corporation. And when I talk to my law students about this, I point out that their market cap, of course, floats with their share price, but I've never seen their market cap dip below $100 billion. And I think that is the problem with Citizens United. We have to share a democracy with these huge, rich entities. So as human beings, we have to try to compete with entities that have just a vast fortune that they could deploy into American elections.
Wow. When you mentioned Kanye West being on the ballot, would he be considered a ghost candidate?
I don't know what Kanye West was doing on the 2020 ballot. It was strange, to say the least. So it's strange because he decides on July 4th of 2020 that he's going to run for president. That is really late in the game if you're serious about it at all. And because he declares so late, the lawyers surrounding him really cut corners trying to get him on the ballot all over the place. They miss deadlines. Sometimes they miss deadlines just by 2 minutes, but that's 2 minutes too late. And because of their sort of bungling, they don't get on the ballot with Kanye West as a candidate in any of the swing states that matter in 2020. But one of the things I point out in Corporatocracy is where he was on the ballot, he could get 10,000 votes in a particular state. If he had gotten 10,000 votes in Arizona or Georgia, that could have flipped the election. So what I strongly suspect, because his campaign was run by Republicans, is that this was a similar plot to break up the black vote. And if you can impact the black vote, and we saw this in 2016, like if you can impact the black vote by telling people to stay home, that impacts who wins the election. If you can impact the black vote by splitting the vote between Biden and Kanye West, then you can impact who wins the election, because for a lot of different historical reasons, the black electorate in the United States is all overwhelmingly Democratic. So if you are a Republican, you either want to split that vote or get that vote to sit out the election. And if you can do either of those things, you make it much more likely that a Republican will win. So I suspect that is what was behind the Kanye West and possibly now the Cornel West candidacies. Like, it's just a really cynical ploy to siphon off black votes such that Republicans end up winning.
Yeah. Because I'm reading like your example after example after example after, I'm like, oh my gosh, this feels so, I feel yucky after reading this. I feel like so defeated. And it feels like even some of these things that are illegal, if you just look for the right loophole and if you just do this the right way, you can still get away with it. So even if it is done legally, like this, the ghost candidates, it seems like in theory it's legal, but it's just dirty.
Well, there were prosecutions in the ghost candidate scandal, and just about a month ago, one of the masterminds was convicted in the ghost candidate scandal. Ironically, what he was convicted of were campaign finance crimes. So in one of the races, the incumbent Democrat's last name was Rodriguez, and the ghost candidate's last name was Rodriguez. And that was done on purpose to trick voters. The man who came up with this idea is a guy named Frank Artiles, who has a little cameo in my book. So he used to be a state senator in Florida. He has to give up his senatorship because he calls people the N-word, and people like report on him, and so he sort of slinks off in disgrace. He also has a habit of getting into bar fights. Anywho, so he was finally convicted, and it's a campaign finance crime because the allegation is he was bribing the ghost candidate, Alex Rodriguez, to be a candidate by giving him more money than is legal to give a candidate in Florida. So ironically, campaign finance laws, which are almost never enforced in Florida, become the way that you get at this pernicious ghost candidate scheme.
But even then, if I'm understanding this correctly, it still feels like some of these people get convicted off of something that's indirect. It's like, let's find something that we can actually get to stick. And it may or may not be the actual really thing that they did wrong.
Well, you could step back and think, how would you even criminalize running ghost candidates? Because you want there to be third parties and independent candidates who throw their hat into the ring. And I think one of the things that can be really depressing as a voter is when you have uncontested election after uncontested election, which just means the incumbent is back, whether people really like that person or not. So it's very difficult to construct a statute that would survive First Amendment scrutiny where what you're capturing is the ghost candidate phenomenon. And so I have to give it to the prosecutors in Florida. They looked at it more broadly and they're like, wait a minute, we think that there was a bribe here. It's somewhat hard to prove bribery, but it does violate the campaign finance laws. So let's use the campaign finance laws to disincentivize this type of behavior in the future.
Right. Well, I think that one to me is a little bit more clear cut. If we look at Donald Trump, I'm always at a loss at why he gets to get off on all of these things. And that's just probably that would take a much longer conversation. But yeah, it just feels like it's so hard. Yes, of course, you want these things to have like you said, ghost candidates and others that are really legitimate. But then when you see parties like abusing that, yes, what they're doing is legal in this instance, like if Kanye really was a ghost candidate, but you are using, like you said, to split the ballot, which doesn't seem fair when it's coming from a political party and not just an individual deciding to run.
Yeah. I mean, it is like most of election law, it is a thorny set of issues.
Speaking of that, can you share some of the campaign finance laws that are in place that do help to curb dark money and these types of abuses? Maybe in a way that I could understand.
I will try. We have campaign finance laws on the books. Some of them date back to the early 1900s. So that law is the Tillman Act, which bars corporations from giving money directly to federal candidates. That law is still in effect. It actually survives Citizens United. And that means that Tesla cannot give money directly to a federal candidate. And same with any company that you like more. And then we have laws that date from the 1970s. These are the post-Watergate reforms. So in that law, which is called FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act, we require disclosure of money in politics so that voters have some sense of who is trying to influence them. That law also requires, if you're a PAC, that you be transparent, and it limits the amount of money that you can give to a federal candidate. So right now, you can give $3,300 per election per candidate. Then we also have public financing, which is another post-Watergate reform. our presidential public financing system worked for several cycles. It is both why we had Jimmy Carter as a president, and it is also why we had Ronald Reagan as a president. So in some ways, it was completely neutral as to party, but it did give a respite to candidates for the highest office in the land from fundraising during the general election. That got killed in the early 2000s, and ever since then, no major party candidate has used public financing, which I think is a real shame. I think we should fix the public financing system so that it's attractive to major party candidates, so that we too get a respite from all of the fundraising that is done by presidential candidates. And I also think that we should have public financing for congressional races as well as state races. It's no accident that most members of Congress are millionaires. I think that is a function of our campaign finance system and who can afford to run for office.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a good tie-in because I liked that you gave quite a long list of things that you felt could be done to fix the problem. And there were numerous ones in addition to what you just mentioned. And some of these are overarching, like expanding the bans on corporate contributions or increasing transparency, et cetera, as well as some corporate and election law reforms. But as individuals, besides voting or not giving our dollars to corporations that are doing things that we find objectionable or that are against democracy, are there things you can suggest that we can do as individuals?
Sure. So one power you might have if you have investments is under our securities laws, you can vote on the proxy. And one thing that shareholder advocates have done over the past 15 years or so is they've been putting shareholder proposals on the proxies of publicly traded companies that ask for either more transparency of money in politics that's spent by corporations in elections and or more transparency of the money that corporations spend lobbying. And if you see that on a corporate proxy, I implore you to bother to vote so that the corporations themselves see that their investors want more transparency of money in politics, and they want to know where companies are lobbying.
I think that's a good point to mention because I think a lot of times, even those of us that might not have thousands and thousands of shares of a particular stock, I think we forget that, oh yeah, but we do have a voice. We can vote as a shareholder. And so I think that's a really good one to point out because I think we forget that.
Yeah, and during the Trump administration, they tried to kill that ability. They had a rulemaking, I didn't even put that in this book, but they had a rulemaking where they were going to essentially take away the ability of shareholders to do this. And there was so much pushback from the investor community that they watered it down. They basically made it such that if you want to be the person who's actually putting up the proposal, you have to own a bigger chunk of stocks and you have to hold them for a longer period of time. But I think in reality, this isn't going to impact the number of shareholder proposals because these shareholder proposals were largely coming from union pensions. Ironically, because of our system, union pension funds are highly invested in the US stock market. And they are long-term holders of these stocks because they need to hold them so that when their retirees retire, there's money to give them for their retirement. But that also means that they are highly invested in these corporations and they have a say in these corporations under our securities laws. So I don't think the meddling that the Trump administration tried to put into this part of the law will actually dissuade much. It wasn't great because anytime you up the threshold for who can do something or lengthen the holding time for people who can do shareholder proposals, it's not great. But they didn't completely ruin it, and they really did want to get rid of it entirely.
That's great. That's great that the investor community fought back. That's awesome because, my gosh, that would be a horrible thing to take away.
Yeah, so I think the other thing I was trying to highlight in this book at certain points is like there's this whole battle going on, which if you read the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal, you know is going on, because it is like a pitched battle between the most free market capitalists and their investors. Mm-hmm. And the investors are screaming at their companies, like, you've got to do better. You've got to do better on human rights. You have to do better on money and politics. You have to do better on the environment. Mm-hmm. And the counter narrative is to call all of these investors woke, which somehow became a pejorative. And so you can find speeches from Ron DeSantis when he was running for president in his short-lived race in 2024, where he's going on like this weird, seemingly, it's almost like he's shadow boxing. He talks about ESG and wokeness as if they were like both the devil. And what he means by ESG is environmental, social, or governance issues within the corporate structure. And part of what I was trying to highlight in this book is how necessary it is for investors to engage in this fight. Because and I think a lot will depend on who we're about to elect in the 2024 election. If you have a regressive administration who sides with the corporations, then they may well gut the ability of shareholders to put in proposals. And I think that would be a real shame, because this has been a source of progress and improvement.
Good point. Well, since you brought up the anti-woke, if my memory serves me correctly, I think Elon Musk had spoken out about wokeness at some point. But I guess I meant to ask you about that, is considering how much he is contributing to Trump, are you seeing any red flags there at all?
So it's hard to know where to start with this one. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. And so I think we should be concerned whenever someone with that much wealth wades into our politics. And he has given in the past, but before the 2024 election, I think the biggest donation I found from Elon Musk on the record was like a $50,000 donation. And that was to like Kevin McCarthy's PAC. And now he has waded in with his own super PAC called America PAC. And according to his own press releases, he has spent over, I think it was $70 million just putting it into that PAC alone. He's also given to various Republican committees in the 2024 election. What the Supreme Court would say about that is he has a First Amendment right to do that. He's had the right to spend his own money on politics ever since Buckley versus Valero back in the 70s. What I find more troubling is he is also sits atop of various corporate empires. So whether it's SpaceX or Tesla, under Citizens United, he could also deploy resources from those corporations. As far as I know right now, he has not done that. But having a billionaire and literally the richest person in the world spend an enormous amount of money trying to elect their candidate of choice, it just makes it that much more difficult for the average person who can only give a little, or in some cases can't afford to give any at all, to keep up.
Well, and I also wonder, though, but if he has his own PAC and he's donating money to it, and it's illegal to give money directly to a candidate, in theory, can't he be going directly if that's his PAC?
So Musk can give as much as he wants to any super PAC, including his own super PAC. Mm-hmm. And then that super PAC has to spend money independently of political candidates. So the super PAC cannot give money directly to the Harris campaign or to the Trump campaign. Mm-hmm. That's like the big firewall between those two universes. And what Tesla can't do is it can't give money directly to the Trump campaign or the Harris campaign. What Tesla can do is it can give money to any super PAC in any amount. And that's the power that was granted because of Citizens United versus FEC.
Wow. Well, I feel like we have barely touched the surface, but I do want to give you an opportunity to add anything else. If there's something that you think is crucial that listeners hear that I haven't touched upon.
Sure. I'll end this way. I often end these things, which is to please, please, please vote. If you are a citizen and over 18 and registered to vote in your state, engage in your democracy. Your democracy needs you.
Excellent advice. Excellent. And then where can people find out more about you and where can they get your book?
So my personal website is cskllc.net. You can also Google my very long name and lots of things should pop up. And then my book is available everywhere where books are sold. So if you're an Amazon fan, go that way. If you're a Powell's Books fan, it's available there. Or you can get it directly from the manufacturer, NYU Press. That's one way of skipping the middleman.
Awesome. And hot off the presses, your book is just coming out November 5th. So people will be able to buy it by the time this podcast is out. So that's awesome.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ciara. It's been awesome having you on here on Reading with Rochelle. And I look forward to having you next time with your next book.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.